In this series of videos, we're going to be talking about classes and objects. So this is part one of the Classes and Objects series. And in this particular series, we're going to be talking about designing and using your own classes. We'll focus on talking about constructors, instance data variables. As part of that, we'll talk about data scope and encapsulation, getters and setters, the toString method, visibility modifiers, invoking methods, and as part of that we'll talk about how Java works as a pass-by value language. So again, this is the first series, part one in classes and objects. So we're going to start with just focusing in on writing our own classes. So when we're writing our own classes, what we want to think about is class design. So a class is a concept of an object. The class really defines a blueprint of what that object is going to look like. So it specifies all of the characteristics and the actions that describe that object. Now once we define that class, so once we have that blueprint, we can then instantiate and create as many objects of that class as we want. So defining the class doesn't actually create anything. It just lays out the design of what objects are going to look like, but it doesn't actually create any objects. So again, you can kind of think about the class as like a blueprint. And if we think about it that way, then you can think about, well, the class is the blueprint, and then we use that blueprint to actually build a house. So the object is the house. You could also think about it like a recipe. So if the class is the recipe, you use that recipe to actually make a cookie. So the cookie would be the object. So again, the class is like the blueprint. It defines what the objects are going to look like, but it doesn't actually create anything. Now when we write these classes, we include kind of two main categories of information. The first is the characteristics or the attributes of our objects, and you'll often hear this referred to as the state of the object. All this is it's the things that describe the object. So it's the characteristics, it's the attribute, it's what describes our objects. And we represent these characteristics as instance data variables. The other category of information that we put inside our classes are the functionality or the actions, sometimes called the behaviors of our objects. So this is where we describe what the object can do or actions that can be taken on the object. And in our classes, we represent this with methods. So our classes are going to define the characteristics of objects and the functionality that those objects can take. Again, it doesn't actually create any objects, it just lays out this definition of what an object looks like and what that object can do. So we're going to start with a practice example, and we're going to use this example throughout the series of slides. We're going to write a class to represent a six-sided die, so also called a number cube. So in thinking about this, the first thing we want to think about are what are the characteristics or the state of this object? Well, certainly we want some way to keep track of what number is showing on the die, right? So we want some way to describe the number that's kind of face up, okay? Now, if we were writing this class to be used inside of a graphical program, we might also have characteristics that describe the color of the die, okay? We might also store an image file that had a picture of the die. Or if we were writing kind of a more general die class, maybe we'd have an instance data variable or characteristic that described how many sides it is, because maybe we have a six-sided die, or we have an eight-sided die, or we have different sizes of dies. Okay, so there's all different kinds of characteristics that we could think about that would describe our die object. For this example, I'm going to keep it very simple, and we're just going to describe it by the instance data variable, by the characteristic of its face value, so the number that's face up on the die. The other thing we want to think about in terms of designing our class is what is the behavior of our object. So what kind of functionality do we want our object to be able to take? Well, the obvious functionality for a die is to be able to roll that die, right? We want to roll it and get a new number facing up. You might be able to think about, again, other actions that you can take with a die, but that's certainly the one that comes to mind. We also need some way to be able to look at and see what number is face up. So that's another action we need to be able to take on our die. So we're going to write a program that again creates this class to represent the die, and then we'll also create a program to actually create the object and print the value of the die. So before I write my die class or begin my die class, I just want to briefly mention the conventions for naming classes. So remember that Java conventions are not part of the Java language, but they are conventions. So if you don't follow these rules, your code will still compile. You're not breaking the language rules, but these are very commonly and widely accepted and followed conventions. So you should get into the habit of following these conventions when choosing your names for classes and variables. So for classes, our class names are capital camel case, and what that means is they start with a capital letter, and each successive word inside the name is also capitalized. So if we had a class graduate student, the G and the S would be capital letters. If we had a class part-time employee, the P, the T, and the E would all be capital letters. So that's the first convention. The second convention is that our class names are usually single nouns. Now this isn't always the case, but it is sometimes the case and usually the case, because these classes again are meant to represent objects. So they're meant to represent a single object. So for example, we have the die class, or the student class, or the employee class, or we all are familiar with the string class and the scanner class. So again, these are all singular nouns. This last one is actually not a convention, but it is a Java rule, and that's the rule that your class name and file name have to match. So your class, if for our example the die class, will be stored in the file die.java. So there are certain components that we put inside all of our classes, and I'm going to call those the building blocks. These are the kind of basic components that are going to go into every class that you write, and there's 4 of them. There's the instance data variables, the constructor, getters and setters, and a toString method. These are the 4 components that you should put pretty much into every single class that you write. Now after you have those basic building blocks, you can then go in and add additional class-specific methods. So for example, we thought about the role method for the die class. Well, obviously the role method doesn't make sense for a student class, right? That's specific to the die class. And you'll have methods like that for each class that you write. So these first 4 components are common across all your classes. They're all going to have these 4 components. And then after that, they're going to have additional methods that just make sense for that particular class. Okay, so in the next video, we'll actually get started with the die class.